The fluorescent lights in the Martinez Auto Group showroom cast harsh shadows across the polished concrete floor as I stood between a gleaming red Camaro and my stepfather's desk. Bob's weathered hands drummed against his leather chair, while my mother Linda leaned against the wall, arms crossed, that familiar look of barely concealed impatience etched across her face. My half-brother Tyler sat sprawled in the corner chair, scrolling through his phone with the casual arrogance of someone who'd never been told no. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah, you need to be realistic here, Bob said, his voice carrying that patronizing tone I'd grown to despise over the 16 years he'd been in our lives. This little inheritance of yours, whatever pocket change your dad's family left you, it's not going to change your life, but Tyler's got real opportunities ahead of him. Graduate school at Stanford doesn't pay for itself. I felt that familiar tightness in my chest, the same sensation I'd experienced countless times growing up in this family where I was always the practical one, the reliable one, the one who was expected to sacrifice for Tyler's dreams. The irony wasn't lost on me that we were having this conversation surrounded by cars worth more than most people's annual salaries, while they dismissed my inheritance as insignificant without even knowing what it contained. Linda pushed off from the wall, her real estate agent persona sliding into place like a well-worn mask. "Honey, I've seen these old family estates before. Usually it's some outdated property that needs work, maybe a small bank account. Nothing wrong with that. But you have to think about the bigger picture. Tyler's education is an investment in all our futures. The bigger picture, right? The same bigger picture that had shaped my entire childhood, where every birthday, every graduation, every achievement of mine became secondary to whatever Tyler needed at the moment. Where my acceptance to UC Riverside had been celebrated with a dinner at Denny's, while Tyler's acceptance to the same school 2 years later had warranted a weekend trip to Las Vegas and a new car. "I haven't even met with the lawyer yet," I said, my voice steady despite the storm brewing inside me. "Maybe we should wait and see what this actually involves before making any decisions." Tyler finally looked up from his phone, his expression a perfect mirror of the entitled smirk he'd perfected by age 15. "Come on, Sarah, how much could it possibly be? Some old relative you never even met. Mom's right, it's probably just some rundown house and a few $1,000s. The responsible thing would be to pool it together and invest in something that actually matters. Something that actually matters, like his future. Like his dreams, like his needs, which had always taken precedence over mine since the day he was born, and suddenly became the center of everyone's universe. The foundation of my resentment had been laid in concrete 15 years earlier, when I was 13, and Tyler was just learning to walk. That was the year my mother decided I was old enough to be responsible, old enough to understand that Tyler's needs came first because he was just a baby and I was practically grown up. It was the year I learned that being the older sibling in this blended family meant being the built-in caretaker, the backup parent, the one who sacrificed so the golden child could shine. My real father had died when I was 8, leaving behind memories of bedtime stories and weekend fishing trips, and apparently, family connections I knew nothing about. David Chen had been a quiet man, an engineer who preferred books to parties and saved every penny he earned. What I didn't know until much later was that his family had a different kind of quiet strength, the kind that accumulated wealth through careful investments and patient planning rather than flashy displays. When Bob married my mother, he brought with him not just his successful car dealership, but also very clear ideas about family hierarchy. Tyler wasn't just his son, Tyler was his legacy, his heir apparent, the boy who would someday take over the Martinez empire. I was the stepdaughter, appreciated, but not essential, loved but not prioritized. The distinction became clearer with every passing year. At 16, when I needed money for SAT prep courses, I was told to get a part-time job at the local coffee shop. When Tyler turned 16, Bob handed him the keys to a brand new Honda Civic and enrolled him in a private SAT tutoring program that cost more than I made in 6 months of serving lattes. When I graduated high school with honors, we had a small family dinner at home. When Tyler graduated 2 years later with a B- average, they threw him a party that filled the backyard with half the neighborhood. College had been my escape route, the path to independence I'd craved since childhood. I'd worked 3 jobs to supplement my financial aid, graduated with a marketing degree and minimal debt, and found a decent position with a local advertising firm. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. My apartment was small but peaceful. My car was paid off, and for the first time in my adult life, I wasn't constantly reminded of how my achievements paled in comparison to Tyler's potential. The call from Margaret Sullivan had come on a Tuesday afternoon while I was reviewing campaign proposals for a local restaurant chain. Her voice was professional, measured, the kind of tone that suggested she dealt with life-changing news as casually as most people discussed the weather. "Miss Chen, this is Margaret Sullivan from Sullivan & Associates. I'm calling regarding the estate of Thomas Chen. I understand he was your father's brother." Thomas Chen. The name was vaguely familiar, mentioned maybe twice in passing when I was younger, but I had no real memory of ever meeting him. My father had been an only child as far as I knew, though I suppose children don't always get the complete family tree. "I'm sorry," I said, setting down my pen and giving her my full attention. "I think there might be some confusion. I don't really know anything about my father's family. He passed away when I was very young. I understand this might come as a surprise," Margaret continued. "Thomas was quite private about his affairs. He passed away 3 months ago, and his will specifically names you as his primary beneficiary. We'll need to schedule a meeting to discuss the details, but I wanted to reach out personally given the significance of the estate." Significance. The word hung in the air like a question mark. In my family's vocabulary, significance was measured in terms of Tyler's future, Bob's business expansion, Linda's next real estate commission. The idea that anything connected to me might be significant felt foreign, almost surreal. "Could you give me some idea of what we're talking about?" I asked, already dreading the conversation I'd have to have with my family. They'd want details, want to know exactly what this mysterious uncle had left behind, want to start making plans before I even understood what I'd inherited. "I'd prefer to discuss the specifics in person," Margaret said, "but I can tell you that Mr. Chen was quite successful in his real estate investments. We're looking at a substantial portfolio." Substantial portfolio. The phrase echoed in my mind as I hung up.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The phone, trying to process what this might mean. In my experience, substantial meant different things to different people. To my college friends, substantial might mean a few $1,000s. To my family, with their car dealership and real estate background, substantial might mean something entirely different. The meeting was scheduled for the following Friday, giving me almost a week to wrestle with whether to tell my family about the call. In the end, it was Linda who forced the conversation. She'd stopped by my apartment Thursday evening with takeout from our favorite Thai place, ostensibly for a casual visit, but clearly fishing for information about my weekend plans. "You seem distracted lately," she said, settling onto my small couch with her pad thai. "Everything okay at work?" I could have lied, should have, probably, but some part of me still craved their approval, still hoped that maybe this time would be different, that maybe an unexpected inheritance would finally make me interesting enough to warrant their genuine attention rather than their calculating interest. "Actually, I got a call from a lawyer," I said, trying to keep my voice casual. "Apparently I inherited something from my father's brother. I didn't even know he existed." Linda's fork paused halfway to her mouth, her real estate agent instincts immediately activated. "Inherited what? Property?" "I'm not sure. The lawyer wouldn't give me details over the phone. I'm meeting with her tomorrow." That's when the calculating look appeared. The same expression Linda got when she sensed a potential commission, or Bob got when he spotted a customer who might be talked into extended warranties. It was the look that said my inheritance had just become a family asset to be managed, distributed, and optimized according to their priorities. Within an hour of Linda leaving my apartment, my phone started buzzing. First Bob, casual but probing, asking if I needed any advice about dealing with lawyers or real estate transactions. Then Tyler, suddenly interested in my weekend plans for the first time in months. By Friday morning, they'd somehow coordinated to meet me for lunch after my lawyer appointment, ready to help me process whatever information I received. The law office of Sullivan and Associates occupied the third floor of a professional building in downtown Riverside, the kind of place where serious money got discussed behind closed doors. Margaret Sullivan was younger than I'd expected, maybe 45, with silver-streaked brown hair, and the calm confidence of someone who delivered both good news and devastating news so many times that her emotional reactions had been filed away in a lockbox. "Thank you for coming in, Sarah," she said, gesturing to a chair across from her mahogany desk. "I know this situation is unusual, inheriting from a relative you never met." Thomas was very specific about wanting his affairs handled privately. She opened a thick folder, revealing documents, photographs, and what looked like property surveys. The first photograph she slid across the desk showed a sprawling ranch house set against rolling hills covered with grapevines, the kind of picturesque California landscape you'd see on postcards advertising wine country getaways. "This is Morning Star Ranch," Margaret said, 240 acres in Temecula Valley. Thomas purchased it in 1987 and spent the next 35 years developing it into one of the region's premier wine grape growing operations. He leased the land to local vintners, but maintained ownership of all the property and infrastructure. I stared at the photograph, trying to reconcile this expansive ranch with my mental image of pocket change and rundown properties. The house alone looked like it belonged in architectural magazines, and the vineyard rows stretched to the horizon like green corduroy. He also owned several commercial properties, Margaret continued, sliding another set of documents across the desk. 3 office buildings in Palm Springs, 2 retail centers in Riverside, and a small apartment complex in Temecula, all fully leased, all generating steady income. The numbers on the income statements made my eyes widen. Monthly rental income that exceeded my annual salary, property values that seemed to have more zeros than should be mathematically possible. I felt like I was looking at someone else's life, someone else's extraordinary good fortune. Thomas was quite the investor, Margaret said, pulling out what appeared to be investment account statements. Conservative but successful, he reinvested most of his income over the years, building a substantial portfolio of stocks, bonds, and mutual funds. My hands trembled slightly as I read the account balances, the numbers so large they seemed abstract, like theoretical mathematics rather than actual money that belonged to me. The total estate value, according to the summary sheet Margaret handed me, was just over $70 million. $70 million. The number hit me like ice water, shocking and surreal. I'd been expecting maybe a small house, maybe some savings. I'd been preparing myself for the kind of modest inheritance that might help me put a down payment on a better apartment, or finally take that vacation to Europe I'd been dreaming about. I hadn't been preparing myself to become wealthier than everyone I'd ever known combined. "I know it's a lot to process," Margaret said, her voice gentle. "Thomas left detailed instructions about the transition. He wanted you to have time to understand the full scope of what you've inherited before making any major decisions. He also left this for you." She handed me a sealed envelope with my name written in careful cursive handwriting. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a letter written in the same precise script. "Dear Sarah," it began. "We never met, but I followed your life from a distance, through the few updates your father shared before his passing. He was proud of your strength, your independence, your ability to build a life for yourself without expecting others to pave the way. I built this wealth slow, with the hope that someday it would go to someone who understood its value, someone who wouldn't squander it, or take it for granted, someone like you. Use it wisely, Protect it carefully, and remember that sometimes the greatest gift is the ability to choose your own path without asking permission from anyone else. Your uncle, Thomas Chen. I read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and slipped it into my purse. The weight of what I'd inherited was starting to settle on me, not just the financial weight but the emotional significance. This quiet uncle I'd never known had been watching, evaluating, deciding that I was worthy of trust that no one in my immediate family had ever shown me. Margaret spent the next hour walking me through the practical details. The ranch was managed by a property management company that had been handling the day-to-day operations for years. The commercial properties had established tenant relationships and professional property managers. The investment accounts were managed by a reputable firm with a track record of steady growth. Thomas had built not just wealth but a sustainable system that could continue generating income with minimal hands-on management required. What happens now? I asked, still struggling to process the magnitude of what I'd learned. That's entirely up to you, Margaret said. The estate is yours. You can maintain the current arrangements, make changes, sell everything, or do nothing at all. Thomas set it up so that you'd have complete control, but wouldn't be overwhelmed with immediate decisions. As I walked out of Margaret's office, the folder of documents tucked under my arm, I felt like I was carrying state secrets. The information inside represented more money than my family had ever imagined, more security than I'd ever dreamed possible, and more power than I'd ever wielded in my 28 years. I also knew, with absolute certainty, that the moment I shared this information with my family, everything would change. The dynamics that had defined my entire life, the hierarchy that had kept me in the background while Tyler shone in the spotlight, the assumption that my contributions would always be modest and my needs secondary, all of that would shift in ways I couldn't predict and might not be able to control. The lunch meeting with my family was scheduled for 1 o'clock at Giuseppe's, the Italian restaurant where we'd celebrated Tyler's 21st birthday with champagne and promises about his bright future. I arrived early, taking a corner booth where I could watch them enter, where I could study their faces before they put on their performance of casual interest in my little inheritance. Bob arrived first, checking his phone and glancing around the restaurant with the restless energy of someone who had more important places to be. Linda followed, her professional smile already in place, ready to offer advice and expertise about whatever small property matter I needed help navigating. Tyler slouched in last, earbuds still in, making it clear that he was doing me a favor by showing up. So Linda said, before the waitress had even brought our menus, "How did it go? What are we dealing with here?" The folder sat on the table beside me, innocent and unremarkable, containing information that would rewrite the story of our family's financial landscape. I looked at their expectant faces, these people who had spent my entire adult life reminding me of my limitations, my modest prospects, my responsibility to support Tyler's dreams with my practical contributions. "It's more complicated than I expected," I said, choosing my words carefully. "There's property involved, some investments. The lawyer says I need to take time to review everything before making any decisions." "Property where?" Bob asked, his car salesman instincts activated. "What kind of investments? Stocks, bonds, real estate?" "A ranch in Temecula," I said, watching their reactions. "Some commercial buildings, investment accounts." Tyler pulled out his earbuds for the first time, suddenly interested. "How big is the ranch? Could you sell it?" "I don't know yet," I lied. "The lawyer wants me to meet with property managers and financial advisors before discussing any sales." Linda's expression shifted into her helpful real estate agent mode, the persona she used when she sensed commission potential. "Honey, Temecula property is hot right now. Wine country always holds its value. If you're thinking about selling, I could connect you with some commercial agents who specialize in agricultural properties." The conversation continued like this for 45 minutes, with each family member offering their expertise, their connections, their advice about how to handle my unexpected windfall. They spoke about my inheritance as if it were a family project, a puzzle that required their collective wisdom to solve properly. Not once did anyone ask how I felt about inheriting property from an uncle I'd never met. Not once did anyone acknowledge that this was my decision to make alone. But underlying all their helpful suggestions was an assumption that had governed our family dynamics for years, that Sarah's resources, whatever they might be, were ultimately available for the family's benefit, that my inheritance, like my salary, and my time, and my energy, existed in service of the greater good, which inevitably meant Tyler's education and future success. As we walked out of the restaurant, Bob put his arm around my shoulders in a gesture that might have seemed paternal to outside observers, but felt calculated to me. Sarah, I want you to know that whatever you decide, we're here to help. This kind of windfall can be overwhelming, especially when you're not used to dealing with significant assets. Maybe we should all sit down this weekend and go through the numbers together. Significant assets. The phrase made me want to laugh and cry simultaneously. If only he knew just how significant. If only any of them understood that their helpful older sister, their reliable backup plan, their source of practical support, had just inherited enough money to buy and sell Bob's entire car dealership empire several times over. That evening, alone in my apartment with the estate documents spread across my kitchen table, I finally allowed myself to process what had really happened. Thomas Chen, a man I'd never met, had chosen me as his heir, not despite my family's treatment of me, but perhaps because of it. He'd seen something in my independence, my self-sufficiency, my ability to build a life without expecting handouts from others. The letter from Thomas felt like a message from beyond, a validation I'd never received from the people who were supposed to love and support me. He'd built this wealth patiently, carefully, and he'd entrusted it to someone he believed would handle it with the same wisdom, someone who wouldn't squander it or take it for granted. As I sat there surrounded by property deeds and investment statements, I realized that Thomas had given me more than money. He'd given me the power to choose my own path, to make decisions based on my own values, rather than my family's expectations. For the first time in my adult life, I didn't have to consider what was best for Tyler, what would help Bob's business, what would make Linda proud of her real estate expertise. I could choose what was best for me. The weight of that freedom was both exhilarating and terrifying. I'd spent so many years being the responsible one, the practical one, the one who made sacrifices for the family's greater good, that the idea of prioritizing my own interests felt foreign and slightly selfish. But Thomas's letter reminded me that sometimes the greatest gift is the ability to choose your own path without asking permission from anyone else. I also knew that my family's reaction to learning the true scope of my inheritance would test every relationship I'd built over the past 28 years. When they discovered that their helpful older sister had inherited not pocket change but life-changing wealth, the dynamics that had defined our family would shift in ways that might not be reversible. But for tonight, in the quiet of my small apartment, surrounded by documents that represented more security than I'd ever imagined possible, I allowed myself to feel something I'd rarely experienced in my family's presence, genuinely valuable, truly chosen, and finally free to write my own story. Part 2. The Weight of Secrets. The morning sun filtered through my apartment's single window as I sat at my kitchen table, surrounded by documents that had transformed my life overnight. 3 days had passed since my meeting with Margaret Sullivan, 3 days of carrying a secret so enormous it felt like swallowing a boulder. Every phone call from my family, every casual text from Tyler, every offer of help from Bob felt loaded with implications they couldn't possibly understand. My phone buzzed with a message from Linda. Thinking about your inheritance situation, maybe we should visit the property this weekend. I could give you a professional assessment. The casual way she inserted herself into my business would have irritated me before, but now it struck me as almost comical. A professional assessment of a $70 million empire from someone who sold suburban 3-bedroom houses for a living. I'd spent those 3 sleepless nights researching everything I could about my inheritance. Morning Star Ranch wasn't just any vineyard property, it was consistently rated among the top grape-growing operations in Southern California. The commercial buildings weren't just random real estate investments, they were premium properties in high-demand areas with waiting lists of potential tenants. The investment portfolio wasn't just stocks and bonds, it was a carefully curated collection of blue-chip securities and growth funds that had been outperforming the market for over a decade. Thomas Chen hadn't just been wealthy, he'd been a financial genius who'd built his empire from nothing while living so modestly that even his own family hadn't suspected his success. According to the property management reports Margaret had given me, he'd driven the same Honda Accord for 15 years and lived in a modest two-bedroom house in Riverside, while owning properties worth tens of millions. The irony wasn't lost on me that Bob, who prided himself on his business acumen and financial success, had built a car dealership empire worth maybe $5 million on a good day, while quietly criticizing my unrealistic dreams and modest prospects. If only he knew that his stepdaughter now controlled more wealth than he could generate in multiple lifetimes of selling cars. But the weight of keeping this secret was starting to affect every interaction with my family. When Tyler called Wednesday evening to ask if I wanted to grab dinner, his usual barely concealed impatience felt different somehow. Was he genuinely interested in spending time with me, or had Linda coached him to stay close and gather more information about my inheritance? "So have you decided what you're going to do with Uncle Thomas's place?" he asked over pasta at our usual spot, his tone carefully casual in a way that immediately put me on alert. "I'm still figuring out the details," I said, twirling linguine around my fork while studying his face. "Why?" "Just curious. Mom mentioned it might be worth something and I've been thinking about graduate school applications. Stanford's program is incredible, but the tuition is insane. I thought maybe, if you ended up with some extra cash, you might want to invest in family, you know." There it was, the expectation that had defined our relationship since childhood, dressed up in new language, but carrying the same familiar message. Sarah's resources, whatever they might be, existed to serve Tyler's ambitions. The assumption was so ingrained in our family dynamic that he didn't even seem to realize how presumptuous the request sounded. "Graduate school is expensive," I agreed, keeping my voice neutral. "Have you looked into scholarships? Research assistant positions?" Tyler's expression flickered with surprise, as if the idea of funding his own education had never occurred to him. "Those are really competitive. Besides, why struggle with loans and part-time work when family could help? I mean, if you've got the resources now." If I had the resources, the phrase echoed in my mind as I drove home that evening, past the strip malls and suburban developments that made up my familiar world. Tyler had no idea that his big sister now controlled more resources than most Fortune 500 companies, that the extra cash he was casually requesting represented less than 1% of what Thomas had left me. But more than the money itself, what struck me was the automatic assumption that my good fortune should naturally flow toward his benefit. Not once had he asked how I felt about inheriting property from an uncle I'd never met. Not once had he considered that maybe I had my own dreams, my own plans, my own right to determine how this windfall should be used. The calls from Bob started Friday morning, not the casual "hey how are you" calls he usually made, but focused business conversations about property management and investment strategies. He'd clearly been researching Temecula real estate values and had opinions about market timing and development potential. "Sarah, I've been thinking about your situation," he said, his voice carrying the confident tone he used when explaining extended warranty benefits to customers. "Temecula's hot right now, but agricultural property can be tricky to manage if you don't know the business. Have you considered selling and reinvesting in something more stable?" "Like what?" "Well, the dealership's been looking to expand. There's a Ford franchise opportunity in Murrieta that could be incredibly profitable. Instead of dealing with vineyard management and tenant farming, you could be a partner in a business that actually generates reliable income." A partner. The word was carefully chosen, designed to make his proposal sound like an opportunity rather than what it really was, a way to funnel my inheritance into his business empire while giving me a minority stake in return. I could almost hear the conversation he'd had with Linda, the two of them plotting how to redirect my unexpected good fortune toward their existing plans. I appreciate the offer, I said, but I think I need to understand what I've inherited before making any major decisions. Of course, Bob said quickly. I'm just saying, when you're ready to explore options, family should be your first consideration. We can structure something that benefits everyone. Everyone except the person who'd actually inherited the assets and might have her own ideas about how to use them. That weekend, I drove out to Temecula alone, following the GPS coordinates Margaret had given me to see Morningstar Ranch for myself. The drive took me through rolling hills covered with grapevines, past boutique wineries and tasting rooms that catered to weekend tourists from Los Angeles and San Diego. The landscape was breathtaking, the kind of California scenery that appeared on tourism brochures and real estate advertisements for luxury properties. When I turned onto the private road marked with a discreet Morningstar Ranch sign, I felt like I was entering a different world. The paved drive wound through perfectly maintained vineyard rows, past irrigation systems and farming equipment that spoke of serious agricultural operation, not hobby farming. The ranch house itself sat on a small rise overlooking the valley, a sprawling single-story structure built from local stone and reclaimed wood that seemed to grow naturally from the landscape. James Rodriguez, the property manager who'd been overseeing the ranch for Thomas, met me in the circular driveway. He was a weathered man in his 60s who carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who'd spent his life working the land and knew every inch of the operation he managed. "Miss Chen, welcome to Morning Star," he said, extending a calloused hand. "Your uncle was a remarkable man. Built all this from raw land but never interfered with the day-to-day operations, trusted the people he hired to do their jobs." As James walked me through the property, I began to understand the scope of what Thomas had created. The ranch wasn't just vineyard land, it included state-of-the-art irrigation systems, climate-controlled storage facilities, and specialized equipment worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. The grape contracts with local wineries were locked in at premium rates through 2030, generating guaranteed income that exceeded what most people earned in their entire careers. The beauty of this operation, James explained as we stood on the deck overlooking the vineyard rows, is that it's completely self-sustaining. The land produces, we maintain it, the wineries buy the harvest, and everyone makes money. Your uncle set it up so that ownership could be completely passive if that's what the heir preferred. Passive ownership of an operation that generated more monthly income than I'd ever made in a year. As we toured the property, I found myself thinking about Thomas, this quiet man who'd built something extraordinary while living so modestly that his own family never suspected his success. He'd created not just wealth but a legacy, something that could continue producing value for generations if managed properly. But he'd also created a burden I was only beginning to understand. With great wealth came great responsibility and great complexity. Every decision I made about this inheritance would have consequences not just for me, but for the people who worked the land, the businesses that depended on the operation, the local economy that benefited from this agricultural success. When I returned to Riverside that evening, I found 3 missed calls from Linda and 2 text messages asking about my weekend plans. The family surveillance network was clearly in full operation, monitoring my movements and gathering intelligence about my mysterious inheritance. I called Linda back, keeping my voice casual as I explained that I'd driven out to look at the property. "How was it?" she asked, her real estate agent excitement barely contained. "What kind of condition is it in? How many acres? Any development potential?" "It's beautiful," I said honestly. "Well-maintained vineyard. The house is nice too." "Vineyard land can be tricky," Linda said, launching into her professional assessment mode. "High maintenance, weather-dependent, regulatory issues with agricultural zoning. Have you thought about subdividing? Temecula's growing fast, lots of demand for residential development. The casual way she suggested destroying a thriving agricultural operation to build tract housing made my stomach clench. This was exactly what Thomas had been trying to protect against when he structured the inheritance the way he had. He built something sustainable and beautiful, and Linda's first instinct was to figure out how to tear it down for quick profit. "I think it's supposed to stay agricultural," I said. "That's part of the appeal." "Well, zoning can always be changed if the numbers work," Linda replied. "We should definitely get it appraised properly. I know some people who specialize in agricultural properties. We should." The assumption that my inheritance had become a family project was becoming more pronounced with every conversation. I was starting to understand why Thomas had been so secretive about his wealth, why he'd chosen to live modestly rather than display his success. Money, especially significant money, had a way of changing how people treated you, how they viewed your relationships, how they calculated their own interests in connection with yours. Monday morning brought a call from Margaret Sullivan with an update on the estate transfer process. The legal paperwork was nearly complete, but she wanted to discuss some additional considerations that had come up during her review of Thomas's instructions. Thomas left some very specific guidance about protecting the estate's long-term viability, she said when I arrived at her office that afternoon. He was concerned about potential family pressure to liquidate assets for short-term benefits rather than maintaining the long-term income stream he'd built. She slid a document across her desk, another letter from Thomas, this one sealed and marked to be opened only after I'd had time to review the full estate portfolio. "Dear Sarah," it read, "by now you understand the scope of what you've inherited, and you've probably started to feel pressure from others who see this wealth as an opportunity to solve their own financial challenges. This is natural and predictable, but it's also exactly what I hope to help you avoid. Wealth brings responsibility, not just to yourself, but to the people whose livelihoods depend on these investments. The ranch employs 12 full-time workers and supports dozens of local businesses. The commercial properties provide affordable office and retail space for hundreds of small enterprises. The investment portfolio generates dividends that support pension funds and retirement accounts for thousands of ordinary people. When you make decisions about this inheritance, please remember that you're not just managing money, you're stewarding resources that affect many lives. Don't let anyone pressure you into quick decisions or dramatic changes. Take time to understand what you have, learn how it works, and then decide what kind of steward you want to be. Trust your instincts, protect what's valuable, and remember that saying no to family pressure isn't selfish, it's responsible." I read the letter twice before folding it carefully and placing it in my purse next to the first one. Thomas had clearly understood the dynamics I was now experiencing, the way family members could reframe their financial needs as collective interests, the pressure to share wealth that had been earned by someone else's lifetime of careful planning. Margaret leaned back in her chair, studying my expression. "Thomas was very concerned about protecting you from exactly the kind of pressure you're probably experiencing right now. That's why he structured everything with such specific instructions about maintaining the asset base rather than liquidating for distributions." "What kind of instructions?" "The estate can generate substantial income for you personally. We're talking about several $1,000,000 annually once everything is fully transitioned. But the principal assets are protected from major liquidation without specific legal procedures designed to ensure you're making decisions based on your own judgment rather than external pressure. Several $1,000,000 annually." The number hit me like a physical force, rendering meaningless every financial worry I'd ever had, every calculation about rent and car payments and retirement savings. I could live comfortably for the rest of my life on the interest alone while preserving the principal for future generations. But I could also understand now why Thomas had been so concerned about protection. This wasn't just money, it was enough money to fundamentally alter the power dynamics of every relationship I had. Enough money to make me a target for every family member's financial needs, every friend's business idea, every romantic partner's lifestyle aspirations. He also set up a family trust option, Margaret continued, if you eventually decide you want to share some of the wealth with relatives, but he specified that such decisions should be made only after you've had at least 1 full year to understand the responsibilities involved. 1 full year, a cooling-off period designed to protect me from making impulsive decisions based on guilt or family pressure. Thomas had thought of everything, including the psychological challenges I'd face as his heir. That evening, I sat in my apartment trying to process the full implications of what I'd learned. I now controlled enough wealth to change not just my life but the lives of everyone in my family. I could pay for Tyler's graduate school without blinking, fund Bob's franchise expansion, help Linda build her real estate business into a regional powerhouse. But I could also see how quickly such generosity might spiral into endless expectations and demands. If I paid for Tyler's graduate school, would I be expected to fund his future business ventures as well? If I helped Bob expand his dealership empire, would I become a permanent bank for his entrepreneurial ambitions? If I shared this windfall with my family, would I ever again be valued for who I am rather than what I could provide? The questions kept me awake most of the night, staring at the ceiling and trying to imagine how to navigate relationships that had suddenly become infinitely more complicated. By morning, I'd reached one conclusion: I needed time to think, plan, and decide what kind of person I wanted to be with this wealth before I told anyone the full truth about what I'd inherited. But keeping such an enormous secret was becoming increasingly difficult as my family's interest in my little inheritance continued to intensify. The casual questions were becoming more frequent and more specific. The offers of help were starting to sound more like demands for inclusion. The assumption that my resources should naturally flow toward family needs was becoming more explicit with every conversation. I was starting to understand that the real challenge Thomas had left me wasn't managing wealth, it was learning to manage the people who wanted access to that wealth. And I was beginning to suspect that before this was over, I'd have to choose between protecting what he'd built and maintaining relationships with people who viewed me primarily as an opportunity rather than a person deserving of their genuine love and respect. The weight of that choice was starting to feel heavier than the responsibility of managing $70 million. Part 3: The Pressure Campaign. The ambush came disguised as a family barbecue. Linda's text message Tuesday morning was innocent enough: spontaneous family dinner tonight. Bob's grilling steaks, come hungry. But when I arrived at their sprawling Mission Grove home that evening, I found Tyler's graduation application spread across the dining room table like evidence in a trial, Bob's laptop open to Stanford's tuition website, and Linda armed with a folder full of real estate comps for Temecula properties. The setup was so obvious it might have been comical if it weren't so calculating. They'd clearly coordinated their approach, dividing responsibilities like a sales team preparing for a major client presentation. Bob would handle the investment angle, Linda would provide market analysis, and Tyler would supply the emotional appeal of his educational dreams deferred. Sarah, perfect timing, Bob said, flipping steaks on the outdoor grill with theatrical enthusiasm. We've been doing some research on your situation, really interesting stuff. I settled into one of their patio chairs, accepting a glass of wine while studying their eager faces. They radiated the kind of focused energy I'd seen Bob use with customers who were wavering on expensive add-ons, that carefully calibrated mixture of helpfulness and urgency designed to overcome hesitation. Linda opened her folder with the flourish of someone unveiling a masterpiece. I pulled recent sales data for vineyard properties in Temecula. Sarah, you're sitting on a gold mine. Agricultural land in that area has appreciated 40% in the last 3 years alone. She spread out printed listings across the patio table, each one circled and annotated with her realtor's precision. Look at this one, acid 60 acres, sold for 2 million last month. And this beauty, acids 45 acres with a farmhouse, 8 million. Your property has got to be worth at least 3 million, maybe more depending on the exact acreage and improvements. 3 million. The number hung in the evening air like smoke from Bob's grill, and I could see the calculations spinning behind their eyes. 3 million divided among family members, minus taxes and expenses, still represented life-changing money for people accustomed to measuring wealth in tens of thousands rather than. Tyler leaned forward in his chair, his expression carrying that earnest intensity he'd perfected for college admissions interviews. Sarah, I've been thinking about what you said the other day about scholarships and research positions. You're right that I should explore those options, but the reality is that opportunities like Stanford don't come around often. The connections I'd make there, the professors I'd work with, it could set up my entire career. He gestured toward his laptop screen, which displayed Stanford's computer science graduate program information alongside a detailed breakdown of costs. Tuition, fees, housing, living expenses. The numbers added up to nearly $200,000 over 2 years. I know it's a lot of money, Tyler continued, but think of it as an investment in the family's future. With a Stanford MBA in computer science, I could start at a tech company making 6 figures immediately. I'd pay back every penny, with interest. The phrase investment in the family's future made something cold settle in my stomach. It was the same language they'd used throughout my childhood to justify every sacrifice I'd made for Tyler's benefit, every opportunity I'd been asked to defer so he could shine. My resources had always been framed as collective assets to be deployed for maximum family benefit, which invariably meant Tyler's advancement. Bob joined us on the patio, carrying a platter of perfectly grilled steaks and wearing the satisfied expression of someone who'd timed his entrance for maximum impact. Tyler's got a point about thinking strategically, he said, settling into his chair with the confidence of someone preparing to deliver a closing argument. Real estate can be volatile, especially agricultural properties. Weather, market conditions, regulatory changes, lots of variables outside your control. He cut into his steak with surgical precision, pausing for effect before continuing. But business ownership, now that's different. That's tangible, controllable, scalable. The Ford dealership opportunity I mentioned is still available, and with your capital injection, we could probably negotiate better terms with the manufacturer. Capital injection. The clinical language was clearly intended to make his proposal sound like sophisticated financial planning, rather than what it actually was, a request for me to bankroll his business expansion with my inheritance. Here's what I'm thinking, Bob continued, warming to his theme. You invest, say, $2 million in the dealership expansion. Tyler uses his portion to finish school at Stanford. Linda could use her share to finally open that boutique real estate office she's been dreaming about. Everybody wins. Everybody wins. The phrase echoed in my mind as I cut small pieces of steak I barely tasted, studying their expectant faces in the glow of the patio lights. They'd clearly spent considerable time planning this presentation, coordinating their arguments, calculating how to divide an inheritance they assumed would naturally become available for family distribution. What struck me most wasn't their greed, exactly, though there was certainly an element of that. It was their complete assumption that my good fortune should automatically translate into their opportunity. Not once in their carefully prepared presentations had anyone asked what I might want to do with this inheritance. Not once had anyone acknowledged that Thomas had chosen me specifically as his heir, not the family collectively. Linda leaned back in her chair, her wineglass catching the light as she gestured expansively. The beauty of this plan is that everyone gets to pursue their dreams instead of just one person sitting on a bunch of property they don't really know how to manage. Sarah, you've never shown any interest in agriculture or real estate investment. Why tie yourself down with something so complicated when you could be free to travel, maybe go back to school yourself, pursue whatever really interests you? The logic was seductive, and I could see how someone less suspicious might be swayed by their arguments. They weren't asking me to give them money, they were offering to free me from the burden of managing assets I didn't understand. They weren't trying to take advantage of my inheritance, they were helping me maximize its potential for everyone's benefit, but underneath their helpful concern, I could hear the familiar refrain that had shaped my entire childhood: Sarah's dreams matter less than Tyler's opportunities. Sarah's preferences are less important than the family's collective interests. Sarah should be grateful for the chance to contribute to something bigger than herself. It's definitely worth considering, I said carefully, buying time while I processed their coordinated presentation, but I want to understand exactly what I've inherited before making any major decisions. Tyler's expression flickered with impatience, the same look he'd worn as a child when he wanted something and couldn't understand why he had to wait for it. How long does that take, though? I mean, it's land and some investments, right? The application deadline for Stanford is in 6 weeks. 6 weeks. The artificial deadline was clearly intended to create urgency, to pressure me into making financial commitments before I'd had time to fully understand what I was giving up. I could see Bob nodding approvingly at Tyler's tactical move, recognizing the sales technique of manufactured scarcity. Tyler's right about timing, Linda chimed in, her professional instincts activated. Real estate markets move fast, especially hot markets like Temecula. If you're going to sell, spring is the optimal time. We could have the property listed and sold within 60 days if we move quickly. The conversation continued for another hour, with each family member cycling through variations of the same basic themes. The inheritance was more than I could handle alone. Families should stick together and help each other succeed. Tyler's education was an investment that would benefit everyone. Bob's business expansion was a sure thing that would generate steady income for years. Linda's real estate expertise was exactly what I needed to navigate this complex situation. By the time I left their house that evening, I felt like I'd been through a high-pressure sales presentation delivered by people who knew exactly which emotional buttons to push. They'd appealed to my insecurities about managing complex assets, my sense of family loyalty, my desire to see Tyler succeed, and my trust in their business expertise. But they'd also revealed something crucial about how they viewed me and my inheritance. To them, I wasn't Sarah Chen, Thomas's chosen heir, trusted with stewarding a carefully built empire. I was Sarah, the family ATM, whose unexpected good fortune could solve everyone else's financial challenges if properly leveraged. The drive home gave me time to think about what I'd experienced, and by the time I reached my apartment, I'd reached a disturbing conclusion. This wasn't going to be a one-time conversation that I could deflect with vague promises to consider their suggestions. This was the beginning of a sustained campaign designed to wear down my resistance and convince me that sharing my inheritance was not just the generous thing to do, but the smart and responsible choice. The evidence arrived the next morning, in the form of a series of text messages that had clearly been coordinated in advance. Tyler sent me a link to an article about the benefits of graduate education in the tech industry. Linda forwarded a real estate newsletter highlighting the strong market for agricultural properties. Bob shared a business journal piece about the profitability of automotive franchises. Each message was followed by casual commentary, designed to reinforce the previous evening's arguments. Tyler noted how much Stanford graduates were earning at Google and Facebook. Linda mentioned that her real estate colleague thought Temecula properties were criminally underpriced for the current market. Bob observed that Ford dealerships were consistently profitable, even during economic downturns. The coordinated nature of their follow-up campaign was almost impressive in its thoroughness. They'd clearly divided responsibilities for maintaining pressure, while avoiding the appearance of overwhelming me with demands. But the underlying message was clear. Every day I delayed making decisions about my inheritance was a day of lost opportunity for the entire family. Thursday brought an escalation in the form of Tyler showing up at my office during lunch, carrying coffee and wearing the slightly rumpled earnestness of someone who'd spent the morning crafting the perfect emotional appeal. Sarah, can we talk? He asked, settling into the chair across from my desk with the familiarity of someone who'd never been told he couldn't have my full attention whenever he demanded it. I've been thinking about our conversation the other night, and I realized I probably came across as entitled or presumptuous, he began, his tone carefully modulated to convey sincerity and vulnerability. That wasn't my intention at all. I know this inheritance is yours, and you have every right to do whatever you want with it. The carefully worded acknowledgement of my rights was clearly intended as the setup for a larger request, the kind of tactical concession lawyers make before presenting their real argument. But I also keep thinking about Dad, your real dad, and what he would have wanted for our family, Tyler continued, invoking my biological father with calculated precision. He was always talking about education, about building something that would last. I feel like he would have seen my Stanford opportunity as exactly the kind of investment he'd want his daughter's inheritance to make possible. The manipulation was so obvious it took my breath away. Tyler had been 7 years old when my father died, far too young to remember any meaningful conversations about education or family values. But he'd clearly calculated that invoking my father's memory would be more emotionally effective than appeals to brotherly affection or family loyalty. I'm not asking for a handout, he pressed on, his voice gaining conviction as he warmed to his theme. I'm asking for a loan, a partnership, an investment in something that could benefit both of us long term. I've already spoken with some professors at Stanford, and they think my research proposal has real commercial potential. We could be talking about patent opportunities, startup possibilities, the kind of tech innovations that create generational wealth. Generational wealth. The phrase was particularly galling coming from someone who'd never created any wealth himself, who'd been supported financially by our parents throughout his entire adult life, who was now asking me to fund his latest ambition with money I'd inherited from an uncle he'd never even met. Tyler, I said carefully, I appreciate that you're excited about Stanford, but I really need more time to understand what I've inherited before I can consider any major financial commitments. His expression shifted slightly, revealing a flash of the impatience he'd been working so hard to conceal. How much time, though? I mean, it's not like you need to become an expert in vineyard management. You hire professionals for that stuff. The important thing is having enough liquid capital to pursue opportunities when they arise. Liquid capital. The phrase revealed more than Tyler probably realized about the family's perception of my inheritance. They weren't thinking about Morning Star Ranch as a thriving agricultural operation that supported dozens of jobs and contributed to the local economy. They were thinking about it as an asset to be liquidated for cash that could be deployed toward their individual priorities. I understand you're feeling pressure about application deadlines, I said, but this is a big decision that affects more than just our family. There are people whose jobs depend on the ranch, tenants in the commercial properties, all kinds of considerations I need to understand. Tyler's face shifted through a series of expressions, confusion, frustration, and finally something that looked like disappointment mixed with accusation. Sarah, I have to be honest, I'm starting to worry that this money is changing you. The sister I know would never prioritize strangers over her own family. The accusation hit its target with surgical precision, triggering exactly the guilt and self-doubt Tyler had intended. Was I being selfish by hesitating to share my good fortune? Was I letting wealth corrupt my values and relationships? Was I becoming one of those people who forgot where they came from once they acquired significant assets? But as I watched Tyler's performance, I also recognized something else. This was exactly the kind of emotional manipulation that had shaped our relationship since childhood. Whenever I'd tried to establish boundaries or assert my own needs, someone in our family had accused me of being selfish, ungrateful, or changing in negative ways. The inheritance had simply given them new language for the same old guilt tactics. Tyler, I'm not trying to prioritize strangers over family, I said. I'm trying to be responsible about a situation that's more complicated than any of us initially realized. He studied my face for a long moment, clearly recalibrating his approach. Look, I get it. This is overwhelming, and Mom and Bob are probably pushing too hard. But here's the thing, opportunities like Stanford don't wait for us to figure out our family dynamics. If I miss this chance, it's gone forever. The artificial urgency was becoming a constant theme in every conversation about my inheritance. Whether it was Tyler's application deadlines, Bob's franchise opportunity, or Linda's hot real estate market, someone was always explaining why immediate action was necessary to avoid catastrophic missed opportunities. But Margaret Sullivan had warned me about exactly this kind of pressure. Thomas's letter had specifically cautioned against making quick decisions based on other people's timelines rather than my own careful consideration. Everything I was experiencing had been predicted by a man who understood wealth and family dynamics far better than I did. After Tyler left my office, I sat staring out the window at the riverside traffic, trying to process what was happening to my family relationships. 3 weeks ago, Tyler barely acknowledged my existence, except when he needed something. Now he was showing up at my workplace, invoking our dead father's memory and making emotional appeals about changed values and family priorities. The transformation wasn't in me, it was in how they perceived me now that they understood I controlled resources they wanted access to. The sister who'd been practical, reliable, and unremarkable had suddenly become fascinating, worthy of attention, deserving of their time and emotional investment. But their attention came with strings attached, and those strings were pulling tighter every day. The casual suggestions were becoming pointed recommendations. The offers of help were starting to sound like demands for inclusion. The assumption that my resources should serve family needs was becoming less subtle and more explicit with every interaction. That evening, Linda called with what she described as exciting news about my inheritance situation. She'd spoken with a colleague who specialized in agricultural properties, and he was confident that Morningstar Ranch could be sold quickly for top dollar if we moved fast. Greg thinks we're looking at $4 million minimum, possibly more if there's a bidding war, Linda said, her excitement palpable even through the phone. He's got 3 clients right now looking for exactly this kind of property. We could have offers by next week. $4 million. The number was significantly higher than her previous estimate, and I suspected it had been inflated to make the sale seem even more attractive. But even at $4 million, they were still wildly underestimating the true value of what Thomas had left me. That's nice, Mom, but I'm still not ready to sell anything. Sarah, honey, I'm trying to help you here, Linda said, her tone shifting toward the patient frustration she'd used when I was a teenager who wouldn't listen to reason. Real estate markets don't stay hot forever. If you wait too long, you could miss the peak and end up selling for significantly less. The manufactured urgency was becoming exhausting. Every conversation with my family now included dire warnings about missed opportunities, market timing, and the catastrophic consequences of delay. They'd created a narrative in which immediate action was financially prudent, while careful consideration was foolishly risky. But I was beginning to understand that their urgency had nothing to do with my best interests and everything to do with their own financial timelines. Tyler needed money for Stanford applications. Bob needed capital for his franchise expansion. Linda needed a commission from a major sale to establish her credentials with high-end clients. My inheritance had become the solution to everyone's individual financial challenges, but only if I could be convinced to liquidate assets quickly and distribute the proceeds according to their respective needs. The longer I delayed, the more likely I might be to discover information that would complicate their plans, or worse, decide to keep the inheritance intact for my own purposes. As I prepared for bed that night, I realized that Thomas's warning about family pressure had been more prescient than I'd initially understood. The people who were supposed to love and support me unconditionally were systematically working to undermine my confidence in my own judgment, create artificial deadlines for major financial decisions, and frame their individual wants as collective family needs. But I was also beginning to understand something else. This pressure campaign was only going to intensify until I either gave them what they wanted or found a way to establish boundaries that they couldn't manipulate or ignore. And given their escalating tactics, I suspected that establishing those boundaries was going to require more than polite deflection and requests for patience. The battle for control of my inheritance was just beginning, and I was starting to realize that the people I'd trusted most in the world were prepared to fight much harder than I'd ever imagined. Part 4: The Final Confrontation. The breaking point came on a Friday morning when I arrived at my apartment to find Bob's truck parked in my spot and my entire family waiting in the lobby of my building. They sat in the small seating area like an intervention team, their faces wearing expressions of concerned determination that immediately put me on high alert. Linda clutched a manila folder thick with documents, Tyler held his laptop open to what looked like financial spreadsheets, and Bob wore his most serious business expression. "Sarah, we need to talk," Linda said, standing as I approached with my grocery bags and coffee. "Really talk. About what's best for everyone involved." The phrase "what's best for everyone" had become their rallying cry, the justification for every suggestion and demand they'd made over the past month. But the fact that they'd ambushed me at my own apartment, coordinating their schedules to corner me when I couldn't easily escape, suggested that their patience with gentle persuasion had finally run out. "Can this wait until later?" I asked, fumbling for my keys while balancing the groceries. "I just got back from the store, and I have some work calls to make." "That's exactly the problem," Bob said, his voice carrying the edge of frustration he'd been working so hard to conceal. "You keep putting this off, asking for more time, avoiding the real conversations we need to have. Meanwhile, opportunities are slipping away." Tyler closed his laptop with decisive snap. "Sarah, the Stanford application deadline is in 10 days. 10 days? I can't wait any longer for you to figure out whether you want to help your own family or not." The accusation hung in the air like a challenge, and I could see in their faces that they'd reached some kind of collective decision about how to handle my continued resistance to their plans. The gentle pressure campaign had been replaced by something more direct and confrontational. "Let's go upstairs," I said, recognizing that this confrontation was inevitable, and preferring to have it in private rather than in my building's lobby where neighbors might overhear. My small apartment felt cramped with all four of us crowded into the living area. Linda immediately spread her documents across my coffee table, while Bob positioned himself near the window with his arms crossed, blocking my view of the parking lot. Tyler settled onto my couch with his laptop, pulling up what appeared to be detailed financial projections. "We've done our homework," Linda began, her tone suggesting this was a formal presentation rather than a family discussion. "Complete market analysis, comparable sales, projected returns on various investment scenarios. We're not asking you to make emotional decisions here, Sarah. We're asking you to look at the numbers." She flipped open her folder to reveal a comprehensive analysis of Temecula real estate values, complete with professional photographs, market trends, and projected appreciation rates. The work was impressive in its thoroughness, clearly representing hours of research and preparation. "Conservative estimate: your property is worth $4.2 million, Linda continued. "But Greg thinks we could get 4.8, maybe even 5 million if we find the right buyer. After taxes and selling costs, you're looking at clear proceeds of around 3.6 million. Tyler leaned forward with his laptop, showing me a spreadsheet that appeared to detail how those proceeds could be allocated. "I've run the numbers on various distribution scenarios," he said, his voice carrying the confident authority of someone who'd spent considerable time preparing his argument. "If you invest $2 million in Bob's dealership expansion, that generates steady income for everyone. My Stanford costs come to about $300,000 total. Mom could use $500,000 to establish her premium real estate practice. That still leaves you with $800,000 for personal use, plus your share of the dealership profits. $800,000 for personal use." The phrase revealed everything about how they'd been thinking about my inheritance. They'd already divided up the proceeds of a sale I'd never agreed to, allocated the majority of the funds toward their individual priorities, and graciously allowed me to keep a portion of my own money for personal use. Bob stepped forward, pulling out his own folder of documents. I've got the franchise agreement right here, ready to sign pending capital availability. The Ford people are excited about the partnership potential, especially with the Martinez name and reputation behind it. This isn't some risky startup, Sarah. This is a proven business model with guaranteed market demand. The coordination of their presentation was flawless, each family member seamlessly transitioning into their assigned role. But underneath their professional preparation, I could sense an undercurrent of desperation that suggested they'd invested considerable emotional and financial energy into plans that depended entirely on my cooperation. I appreciate all the work you've put into this, I said carefully. But I'm still not ready to make any major decisions about selling the property. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Tyler's expression shifted from confident enthusiasm to something approaching disbelief. Linda's professional smile flickered and died. Bob's jaw tightened in the way it did when customers balked at his final offers. Sarah, I don't think you understand what's happening here, Linda said, her voice taking on a sharper edge. This isn't a game. Tyler's future is on the line. Bob's expansion opportunity won't wait for you to overcome whatever psychological issues you're having about making adult decisions. Psychological issues. The phrase was clearly calculated to sting, to suggest that my hesitation stemmed from emotional problems rather than legitimate concerns about their increasingly aggressive demands. Tyler slammed his laptop shut, his carefully maintained composure finally cracking. You know what I think is happening? I think this money is going to your head. You've never had any real assets before, and now you're playing games with people's lives because it makes you feel powerful. The accusation was so unfair, so deliberately cruel, that it took my breath away. For a moment, I could only stare at my half-brother, this young man I'd supported and encouraged throughout his entire life, now attacking my character because I wasn't immediately funding his graduate school dreams with an inheritance he had no legal or moral claim to. Tyler, that's not fair, and you know it, I said, my voice shaking with a mixture of hurt and anger. I've never tried to control anyone or play games with this inheritance. I've simply asked for time to understand what I've inherited before making permanent decisions about it. Time, Bob repeated, his voice heavy with sarcasm. How much time do you need to understand that land can be sold for money, and money can be invested in profitable businesses? This isn't rocket science, Sarah. You're making it complicated because you want to feel important. The attack on my motives was breathtaking in its unfairness, but it also revealed something crucial about how my family really saw me. To them, I wasn't someone who might have legitimate reasons for caution about major financial decisions. I was someone whose natural state was insignificance, and who was now artificially inflating my own importance by controlling resources they believed should be shared. Maybe we need to talk about what's really going on here, Linda said, settling back in her chair with the expression of someone preparing to deliver a difficult truth. Sarah, you've always been the responsible one in this family, and we've always appreciated that. But responsibility means making decisions that benefit the people you care about, not hoarding opportunities out of some misguided sense of individual entitlement. Individual entitlement. The phrase was particularly galling coming from people who'd spent the past month detailing their individual financial needs and explaining why my inheritance should solve their respective problems. I'm not hoarding anything, I said. I'm trying to be responsible about managing assets that affect more than just our family. There are employees at the ranch, tenants in the commercial buildings, all kinds of people whose livelihoods depend on these properties continuing to operate successfully. Tyler laughed, a sound devoid of humor. Oh, so now you're concerned about strangers but not your own brother. That's rich, Sarah, really rich. The contempt in his voice was like a physical slap. This was the brother I'd helped with homework, driven to soccer practice, celebrated with at every birthday and graduation. Now he was looking at me like I was a selfish stranger who'd betrayed everything he thought he knew about my character. Bob moved closer to where I sat, his presence clearly intended to be intimidating. Let me tell you what I think is really happening here, he said, his car salesman confidence replaced by something colder and more calculating. I think you're enjoying this. Having people ask you for things, having control over decisions that affect other people's futures. It's the first time in your life you've had any real power, and you don't want to give it up. The psychological analysis was so wrong, so deliberately cruel in its mischaracterization of my motives, that I felt something inside me shift from hurt to anger. These people who claimed to love me were systematically attacking my character, questioning my values, and imputing the worst possible motives to my entirely reasonable request for time to understand a complex inheritance. You want to know what I really think? I said, standing up and moving toward my kitchen counter where I'd left Margaret Sullivan's business card. I think you've spent so many years treating me like the family support system that you can't imagine I might have my own priorities and concerns. I think you're so focused on how my inheritance can solve your individual problems that you've never once asked what I might want to do with it. I picked up my phone and started dialing Margaret's number, my hands shaking with adrenaline and anger. You want to know what I've inherited? You want to understand why I'm taking time to make careful decisions? Fine, let's call my lawyer and get all the facts on the table. Linda's expression shifted from frustrated determination to something approaching alarm. Sarah, there's no need to involve lawyers in a family discussion. Isn't there? I asked, the phone ringing in my ear, because it seems like you've all made major financial plans based on assumptions about assets you know nothing about. Maybe it's time everyone understood exactly what we're talking about. Margaret answered on the third ring, her professional composure immediately apparent even over the speakerphone. Sarah, how can I help you? Margaret, I'm here with my family, and they have some questions about the inheritance from Thomas. Would you be able to explain the basic details of the estate? There was a brief pause, and I could almost hear Margaret evaluating the situation through the phone. Of course, what would you like to know? Bob stepped forward, his business instincts taking over. We understand Sarah inherited some agricultural property and investments. We're trying to help her understand the market value and investment potential. I see, Margaret said carefully. Well, the Thomas Chen estate is quite substantial. The Morning Star Ranch alone is valued at approximately $18 million, based on recent appraisals of the land, infrastructure, and ongoing agricultural operations. The commercial real estate portfolio adds another $32 million, and the investment accounts total approximately $20 million. The total estate value is just over $70 million. The silence that followed Margaret's statement was so complete I could hear the refrigerator humming in my kitchen. Tyler's mouth hung open, Linda had gone pale, and Bob looked like someone had just explained that gravity worked backwards. 70 million. Linda whispered, her voice barely audible. Yes, Margaret continued, apparently unaware of the bombshell she'd just dropped. Thomas was quite successful in his investments over the decades. He structured everything to generate steady income while preserving the principal assets. Sarah should see annual income of approximately $4 to $5 million from the various properties and investments. Tyler made a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. Bob sank into the nearest chair, his face cycling through expressions of shock, calculation, and what looked like greed. Linda stared at me as if I'd transformed into someone she'd never seen before. Thank you, Margaret, I said, ending the call before anyone could ask additional questions that might reveal how little they'd understood about my situation. The silence stretched for what felt like several minutes before Bob finally spoke. $70 million, he repeated, as if testing whether the words sounded real when spoken aloud. Jesus Christ, Sarah, 70 million. Tyler was staring at his laptop screen, apparently running new calculations based on the numbers Margaret had provided. The dealership thing, he said slowly, that's like pocket change to you now. Stanford, Mom's real estate office, everything we've been talking about, it's all pocket change. Pocket change. The phrase they'd used to dismiss my inheritance just weeks ago now applied to their own financial needs and dreams. The irony would have been amusing if the situation weren't so fundamentally changed by this revelation. Linda was still staring at me with an expression that mixed wonder and something that looked almost like fear. Sarah, honey, do you understand what this means? You're wealthy, really truly wealthy. You could do anything, buy anything, go anywhere in the world. I could, I agreed, but that doesn't change the fact that I need time to understand the responsibilities that come with managing this kind of wealth. Bob stood up abruptly, beginning to pace around my small living room like a caged animal. Responsibilities, he repeated. Sarah, with this kind of money, you could help everyone in this family achieve their dreams, and still have more left over than most people see in 10 lifetimes. And there it was, the assumption that had driven every conversation, every suggestion, every demand they'd made over the past month. The belief that my resources, no matter how substantial, should naturally flow toward their individual needs and priorities. But something had shifted in their demeanor since learning the true scope of my inheritance. The gentle pressure and emotional appeals had been replaced by something more intense, more desperate. The knowledge that I controlled $70 million had raised the stakes beyond anything they'd previously imagined. Tyler closed his laptop and looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before, something that combined calculation with a kind of predatory hunger. Sarah, we need to talk seriously about family investments, not just Stanford, not just the dealership. We're talking about generational wealth here. Money that could set up everyone in this family for life. Everyone in this family except the person who actually inherited it, I said quietly. The words hung in the air like an accusation, and I could see in their faces that they were finally beginning to understand the fundamental problem with their approach. They'd been so focused on how my inheritance could serve their needs, that they'd never seriously considered that I might have my own plans, my own dreams, my own right to determine how this wealth should be used. But I could also see that the revelation of the true estate value had changed something essential about how they viewed this situation. The casual suggestions and emotional appeals had been replaced by something more urgent, more desperate. $70 million represented more opportunity than any of them had ever imagined having access to, and they weren't going to give up easily. Linda pulled herself together first, her real estate training helping her recover from the shock faster than the others. Sarah, I think we all need to step back and approach this more systematically. This kind of wealth requires professional management, careful planning, strategic thinking about tax implications, and investment diversification. The pivot to professional language was clearly intended to re-establish her role as someone whose expertise I needed, but it also revealed how quickly she was adapting to the new reality. Instead of helping me sell a $4 million ranch, she was now positioning herself as an advisor for a $70 million empire. Bob was nodding eagerly, his business instincts fully activated. Linda's right, this isn't the kind of money you manage alone. You need a team, people you trust, family members who understand your best interests. A team, people I trust, family members. The language was carefully chosen to make their involvement sound like professional necessity rather than personal enrichment. But I could see the calculations spinning behind their eyes, the mental arithmetic of what percentages of $70 million might look like if properly negotiated. I appreciate your concern, I said, but I already have professional advisors. Margaret Sullivan is handling the legal aspects, and Thomas set up relationships with property managers and investment advisors who've been successfully managing these assets for years. Tyler's expression darkened. So you're going to trust strangers over your own family? I'm going to trust the people Thomas trusted, I replied. The people who helped him build this wealth over decades of careful planning and conservative management. The reference to Thomas and his wisdom was clearly not what they wanted to hear. It reminded them that this inheritance hadn't been random luck or unfortunate accident. It had been a deliberate choice by someone who'd evaluated potential heirs and selected me specifically as the person he trusted to continue his legacy. Bob's frustration was becoming more evident with each passing moment. Sarah, I'm going to be blunt here. This family has supported you your entire life. We've been there for you through everything. College, job searches, relationship problems, all of it. Now you have the opportunity to give back, to help the people who've always been there for you, and you're acting like we're strangers trying to take advantage of you. The revisionist history was breathtaking in its audacity. Bob had married into our family when I was 12 years old and had spent the subsequent 16 years making it clear that Tyler was his priority, while I was merely an obligation inherited along with my mother. The idea that he'd been my primary support system was so false, it would have been laughable if it weren't so manipulative. Linda joined the emotional appeal, her voice taking on the wounded tone she used when she felt unappreciated. "Honey, all we're asking for is the chance to be part of this blessing, to share in the good fortune that came to our family. Is that really so unreasonable?" Our family. The phrase was particularly galling, coming from people who'd spent years making it clear that I was the outsider, the one who didn't quite belong, the one whose needs came last when resources were allocated or attention was distributed. But I was also beginning to understand that no amount of explanation or reasoning was going to satisfy them. They'd convinced themselves that my inheritance was a family windfall that should naturally be shared according to their assessment of individual needs and priorities. The fact that Thomas had specifically chosen me as his sole heir, the fact that the law recognized my complete ownership of these assets, the fact that I had every right to manage this inheritance according to my own judgment, none of that mattered to them. What mattered was their belief that family resources should be communal, their assumption that my good fortune created obligations to solve their financial challenges, and their conviction that refusing to share wealth with relatives was inherently selfish and morally wrong. "I understand that you feel entitled to part of this inheritance," I said carefully. "But Thomas left these assets to me specifically, with detailed instructions about protecting them for the long term, rather than liquidating them for short-term benefits." Tyler laughed bitterly. "Entitled? Sarah, you're talking about your own family like we're gold diggers trying to scam you. Do you hear yourself? The accusation was designed to make me feel guilty for setting boundaries, for asserting ownership over assets that legally and ethically belong to me alone. But it also revealed how completely they'd reframed the situation in their own minds. In their version of events, I was the selfish family member refusing to share good fortune, while they were the reasonable relatives asking for their fair portion of a windfall that should naturally benefit everyone. Bob stood up and moved toward the door, his expression suggesting he'd reached some kind of decision. "Sarah, I'm disappointed in you. Really disappointed. I thought we raised you to understand the importance of family loyalty and mutual support, but apparently $70 million is enough to make you forget where you came from and who was there for you when you needed help." The emotional manipulation was so obvious, so deliberately cruel in its mischaracterization of my motives and values, that I felt the last of my guilt and uncertainty evaporate. These people who claimed to love me were prepared to attack my character, question my values, and destroy our relationships, rather than accept that I had the right to make my own decisions about my own inheritance. "I haven't forgotten where I came from," I said quietly. "But I also haven't forgotten who I am, or what I believe is right. Thomas trusted me with this wealth because he believed I would handle it responsibly. That means taking time to understand the full implications of any major decisions, not rushing into commitments because other people have created artificial deadlines." Linda gathered her documents from my coffee table, her movements sharp with frustration. "Fine, Sarah, take all the time you need. But don't come crying to us when you realize you've chosen money over family." The threat was clear: refuse to share the inheritance on their terms, and face exile from the family relationships that had defined my entire life. It was the ultimate manipulation, the final attempt to force my compliance through emotional blackmail. But as I watched them file out of my apartment, their faces set in expressions of disappointment and betrayal, I realized something profound had shifted inside me. The fear of losing their approval, the guilt about not meeting their expectations, the anxiety about being seen as selfish or ungrateful, all of that had been replaced by a clear understanding of what Thomas had really given me. He hadn't just left me $70 million. He'd given me the power to choose my own path, to prioritize my own values, to build relationships based on mutual respect rather than financial obligation. He'd freed me from the need to ask permission or seek approval from people who viewed me primarily as a resource to be managed rather than a person to be valued. The apartment felt larger somehow after they left, filled with a kind of peace I hadn't experienced since receiving that first call from Margaret Sullivan. For the first time in my adult life, I was truly free to be myself, to make decisions based on my own judgment, to pursue my own dreams without constantly calculating how those choices would affect other people's plans for my life. I walked to my window and looked out at the familiar view of Riverside, the city where I'd built a modest but satisfying life through my own efforts and determination. Soon I'd have the resources to live anywhere in the world, to pursue any dream that interested me, to create whatever kind of life I could imagine. But more than the money itself, I now understood the deeper gift Thomas had given me, the realization that I didn't need anyone's permission to be happy, successful, or fulfilled. I didn't need to justify my choices to people who viewed my resources as their opportunity. I didn't need to apologize for prioritizing my own values and judgment over their demands and expectations. The inheritance had revealed something crucial about my family relationships, something I might never have understood without this test of their true priorities. When faced with the choice between supporting my right to make my own decisions and pursuing their own financial interests, they'd chosen money over genuine love and respect. That knowledge was painful, but it was also liberating. Thomas had given me more than generational wealth. He'd given me the clarity to see which relationships were worth preserving and which were based on expectations that could never lead to genuine happiness or mutual respect. As I prepared for bed that night in my small apartment, surrounded by documents representing more security than I'd ever dreamed possible, I felt genuinely grateful for the first time since this whole journey began. Not just for the money, though that was certainly life-changing, but for the wisdom to understand what Thomas had really been trying to protect me from. He'd known that wealth would reveal the true nature of my relationships, force me to choose between being liked and being respected, challenge me to decide what kind of person I wanted to be when I finally had the power to be anything at all. Tomorrow I'd start building the kind of life he'd made possible, one based on my own values, my own dreams, and my own definition of what it meant to use great wealth responsibly. And for the first time in my 28 years, I'd do it without asking anyone's permission or worrying about anyone else's approval. The inheritance had cost me a family, but it had given me something far more valuable: myself. The silence that followed my family's dramatic exit lasted exactly 3 days before the real campaign began. I should have known that people who'd coordinated a month-long pressure operation wouldn't simply walk away from $70 million because of one difficult conversation. But I hadn't anticipated the sophistication of their next approach, or how completely they would abandon any pretense of caring about my feelings in favor of pursuing what they now saw as their rightful claim to generational wealth. The first sign came in the form of a certified letter delivered to my office Monday morning. The return address belonged to Hendricks, Walsh and Associates, a law firm I'd never heard of, but the letterhead suggested the kind of expensive legal representation that specialized in complex financial disputes. My hands trembled slightly as I opened the envelope, already suspecting what I'd find inside. "Dear Miss Chen." The letter began in the formal language of legal intimidation. "We represent the interests of Linda Martinez, Robert Martinez, and Tyler Martinez in the matter of the Thomas Chen estate distribution. Our clients have retained our services to address what they believe to be significant irregularities in the estate settlement process and to pursue their legitimate claims to a portion of the inherited assets." The letter went on to detail a series of accusations that would have been laughable if they weren't so obviously calculated to create legal complications. They claimed that Thomas had been mentally incompetent when he wrote his will, that I had exercised undue influence over an elderly relative I'd never met, and that the estate should be distributed according to California's intestacy laws rather than Thomas's explicit instructions. But the most disturbing element wasn't the legal threats themselves. It was the detailed knowledge the letter demonstrated about my inheritance. They knew about specific properties, investment account values, even the names of the management companies Thomas had used. Someone had clearly spent considerable time and money investigating every aspect of the estate, preparing for a legal battle that could tie up the assets for years while generating enormous attorney fees. I called Margaret Sullivan immediately, reading the letter to her over the phone while pacing around my office like a caged animal. Her response was measured but clearly concerned about the implications of my family's new strategy. "This is exactly the kind of challenge Thomas was worried about," she said. "He specifically structured the estate planning to make these kinds of claims difficult to pursue, but that doesn't mean your family can't try to create problems. The good news is that the legal foundation for the inheritance is rock solid. The bad news is that even frivolous challenges can be expensive and time-consuming to defend against." Margaret explained that Thomas had anticipated family challenges and had prepared accordingly. He'd undergone extensive psychological evaluations to document his mental competency, maintained detailed records of all financial decisions, and structured the estate transfer through multiple legal mechanisms designed to withstand exactly this kind of attack. "But they're clearly willing to spend significant money on legal fees," Margaret continued. "That suggests they've calculated that the potential payout is worth the investment even if their chances of success are minimal." The calculation was simple and chilling. Even if they only had a 10% chance of winning a substantial settlement, 10% of $70 million represented enough money to justify enormous legal expenses. They were essentially using the legal system as a lottery ticket, betting that they could create enough complications and expenses to force me into a settlement rather than endure years of costly litigation. But their legal strategy was only the beginning. That evening, I received a phone call from my cousin Maria, Linda's sister, who lived in San Diego and had always maintained a friendly but distant relationship with our immediate family. "Sarah, I'm so sorry to bother you," Maria said, her voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone who'd been rehearsed on exactly what to say. "But Linda called me this weekend and I have to say I'm really concerned about what she told me." The concern was clearly manufactured, but I listened as Maria repeated a carefully edited version of recent events that painted me as someone who'd become cruel and greedy after inheriting money from a relative my family had been close to. According to Linda's version, Thomas had been like a grandfather to all of us, and his intention had clearly been to benefit the entire family rather than just one person. "I know Linda can be dramatic sometimes," Maria continued, "but she was really upset. She said you'd completely cut off communication with Tyler about his education needs, and that you'd refused to even consider helping Bob with his business expansion. She's worried that this money is changing you in ways that could permanently damage your family relationships." The narrative was so skillfully constructed, so carefully designed to make me appear as the villain in a story about family conflict, that I found myself wondering if other relatives were receiving similar calls. Linda had clearly decided that public opinion could be as valuable as legal pressure in forcing me to reconsider my position. "Maria, I don't think Linda gave you the complete picture," I said carefully. "This inheritance situation has been more complicated than anyone initially understood, and I've been trying to handle it responsibly while dealing with a lot of pressure from everyone to make immediate decisions." Of course," Maria said quickly. "I'm not taking sides here. I just hate to see family fighting over money. Maybe there's a way to work things out that makes everyone happy." Everyone happy. The same phrase my immediate family had been using to justify their demands, now being deployed by extended relatives who were clearly being recruited as mediators in a conflict they knew nothing about. I could see Linda's strategic thinking behind the approach: use family members I actually liked and respected to deliver messages that might be more persuasive than direct confrontation. The campaign escalated throughout the week. My uncle Roberto, Bob's brother, called to suggest that family wealth should be shared according to need rather than legal technicalities. My cousin Jennifer, Tyler's age and someone I'd always enjoyed spending time with, sent a carefully worded text about how excited she was about Tyler's Stanford opportunities, and how proud the whole family would be if his dreams came true. Each contact was perfectly calibrated to apply pressure without appearing manipulative, to suggest that my resistance to sharing the inheritance was causing pain and disappointment throughout an extended family network that had previously viewed me as a generous and caring person. But the most sophisticated element of their strategy became apparent when I received a call from Dr. Elizabeth Warren, my former boss at the advertising firm and someone whose opinion I genuinely valued. Her voice carried the concerned professionalism of someone who'd been approached by people claiming to be worried about my well-being. "Sarah, I hope you don't mind me calling," she said, "but I had a visit from your stepfather and brother this week. They're concerned about some family situation involving an inheritance, and they wanted me to reach out to you as someone who knows you professionally." The fact that Bob and Tyler had approached my former boss, involving my professional reputation in their campaign to pressure me into sharing my inheritance, represented a level of calculated manipulation that took my breath away. They were systematically working to isolate me, to make me feel like everyone I respected was questioning my judgment and character. "They seem to think you might be struggling with the responsibility of managing significant assets," Elizabeth continued carefully. "They mentioned that you'd become distant and defensive when they tried to offer help and guidance. I told them that didn't sound like the Sarah I know, but they were quite convincing about their concerns. I could almost see the performance Bob and Tyler had delivered, portraying themselves as loving family members worried about a sister who'd been corrupted by sudden wealth and was making decisions that could harm both her own future and the welfare of people who depended on her support. Elizabeth, I appreciate you reaching out," I said, "but I think my family may have given you a somewhat one-sided version of recent events. This inheritance situation has been more complex than anyone initially realized, and I've been taking time to understand my responsibilities before making any major decisions." "That sounds very reasonable," Elizabeth said, and I could hear the relief in her voice. "I have to say, the version they presented didn't really match my experience of your judgment and character. But they seemed quite distressed about the family conflict." After ending the call with Elizabeth, I sat in my apartment trying to process the scope of the campaign my family had launched against me. They weren't just pressuring me directly anymore, they were systematically working to undermine my relationships, damage my reputation, and create a narrative in which I was the unreasonable party in a family conflict over money. The realization was both infuriating and clarifying. These people who claimed to love me were prepared to destroy my professional reputation, manipulate extended family relationships, and lie to mutual acquaintances rather than accept that I had the right to make my own decisions about my own inheritance. But their strategy also revealed something important about their assessment of the situation. They clearly believed that isolation and public pressure could accomplish what direct confrontation had failed to achieve. They thought that if enough people questioned my judgment and character, I'd eventually cave to the social pressure and agree to share the inheritance on their terms. What they hadn't calculated was how their tactics would affect my perception of our relationships. Every manipulative phone call from recruited relatives, every lie told to mutual acquaintances, every attempt to damage my professional reputation made it clearer that these weren't people who loved and respected me. These were people who viewed me as an obstacle to overcome in pursuit of financial gain. The turning point came Thursday evening when I received a call from James Rodriguez, the property manager at Morning Star Ranch. His voice carried the careful politeness of someone delivering potentially bad news to his employer. "Miss Chen, I'm sorry to bother you, but I had some visitors today who claimed to be family members conducting a property inspection. They said you'd authorize them to review the ranch operations and financial records." My stomach dropped as James described the visit from Bob, Tyler, and Linda, who'd apparently driven to Temecula with a story about helping me evaluate the property for potential sale. They'd ask detailed questions about income statements, lease agreements, and property valuations, clearly gathering intelligence for their legal challenge. I didn't provide any confidential information, James continued, but they were quite persistent about wanting access to financial records and operational data. They seemed surprised when I told them that only you and your attorney have authorization to review those materials. The unauthorized visit to my property represented a new level of invasiveness that crossed clear legal and ethical boundaries. But it also demonstrated how seriously they were taking their campaign to claim a portion of the inheritance. They weren't just making emotional appeals or applying social pressure anymore, they were conducting reconnaissance, gathering ammunition for legal challenges, treating my assets like territories to be scouted and potentially conquered. I called Margaret Sullivan immediately, reporting the unauthorized property visit and expressing my growing concern about my family's escalating tactics. Her response was swift and decisive. "This changes the dynamic significantly," she said. "Unauthorized access to property, misrepresentation to employees, attempts to obtain confidential financial information, these are serious boundary violations that could constitute harassment or even criminal trespass." Margaret explained that Thomas had anticipated exactly this kind of pressure campaign and had included specific protections in the estate planning documents. If family members attempted to interfere with property operations or harass employees, the trust included provisions for obtaining restraining orders and pursuing legal remedies that could actually strengthen my position rather than weakening it. Thomas dealt with his own family pressure when he was building this wealth, Margaret continued. He learned that some people will never accept that wealth belongs to the person who earned it or inherited it legally. He built these protections specifically to help you handle exactly what you're experiencing now. The conversation with Margaret was both reassuring and sobering. Reassuring because it confirmed that I had legal tools to protect myself and the inheritance from my family's increasingly aggressive tactics. Sobering because it made clear that this conflict was likely to continue escalating until someone decided to back down or until legal intervention forced a resolution. But I was also beginning to understand something crucial about my own character and values. The past month had been a masterclass in manipulation, emotional blackmail, and coordinated pressure designed to override my judgment and force decisions that served other people's interests. Instead of breaking down under that pressure, I'd become clearer about my own principles and more confident in my right to make independent decisions. Friday morning brought the confrontation I'd been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. I arrived at work to find Bob and Tyler waiting in the parking lot, their expressions carrying the grim determination of people who decided that subtle approaches had failed, and direct confrontation was their only remaining option. "Sarah, we need to talk," Bob said, approaching my car before I'd even turned off the engine. "Really talk, without lawyers or other people getting in the way." Tyler stood slightly behind his father, his expression cycling between anger and something that might have been desperation. "You can't just ignore your own family forever," he said. "We deserve an explanation for why you're choosing strangers over the people who've always been there for you." The accusation was so unfair, so completely contrary to the actual facts of our relationships, that I felt the last of my patience evaporate. These people had never been there for me in any meaningful way. They'd tolerated my presence, utilized my support when convenient, and expected my resources to flow toward their priorities. But they'd never genuinely supported my dreams, celebrated my achievements, or valued my judgment. "I'm not choosing strangers over family," I said, getting out of my car and facing them directly. "I'm choosing to handle my inheritance responsibly, instead of liquidating everything to fund other people's immediate wants." Bob's expression hardened, his car salesman charm finally giving way to the cold calculation underneath. "Your immediate wants, you mean? Because that's what this is really about, isn't it? Having power over people who used to be your equals." The psychological analysis was so wrong, so deliberately cruel in its mischaracterization of my motives, that I almost laughed. These people who'd spent my entire adult life reminding me of my limitations and modest prospects were now accusing me of having delusions of superiority. Bob, I've never thought of you as my equal, I said quietly. I've thought of you as my stepfather, someone who was supposed to care about my welfare and happiness. But this past month has made it clear that you've never seen me as anything more than a resource to be managed for Tyler's benefit. Tyler stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. That's bullshit, Sarah, and you know it. We've always treated you like family, have you? I asked. Because I remember being told to get a job to pay for SAT prep while you got private tutoring. I remember missing family vacations because there wasn't enough money, while you got new cars and college funds. I remember being expected to contribute to family expenses while you were encouraged to focus on your studies and dreams. The specific examples seemed to deflate some of Tyler's righteous anger, reminding him of dynamics he'd apparently forgotten or chosen to ignore. But Bob wasn't ready to acknowledge any history that complicated their narrative of family equality and mutual support. Ancient history, he said dismissively. We're talking about the present, about your responsibility to help family members who need support. My responsibility, I repeated, interesting phrase. Because I don't remember anyone talking about responsibility when Tyler needed college tuition or when you needed capital for business expansion. Then it was always about loans and investments and partnership opportunities. It's only now, when I'm saying no, that it's become about family responsibility and obligation. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Bob and Tyler cycling through every argument they'd used over the past month. Family loyalty, missed opportunities, the corrupting influence of wealth, my alleged character changes, the unfairness of legal technicalities that prevented them from accessing what they viewed as family assets. But something had fundamentally changed in my response to their pressure. Where once I'd felt guilt and uncertainty, I now felt only clarity about the manipulative nature of their tactics. Where once I'd worried about damaging family relationships, I now understood that genuine relationships couldn't be built on financial dependency and emotional blackmail. I'm done with this conversation, I said finally, walking toward my office building. And I'm done with the phone calls from relatives, the unauthorized visits to my property, and the lies you've been telling to mutual acquaintances. If you continue harassing me or interfering with the estate operations, I'll pursue legal remedies. Bob called after me, his voice carrying a note of desperation I'd never heard before. Sarah, don't do this. Don't let money destroy our family. I turned back to face them one last time, these people who'd shaped so much of my life through their expectations and demands. I'm not destroying anything, Bob. I'm just refusing to let you control my decisions anymore. The 6 months that followed were simultaneously the most difficult and most liberating of my life. The legal challenge my family pursued went exactly as Margaret had predicted, expensive for them, unsuccessful in court, and ultimately dismissed with prejudice after the judge reviewed Thomas's comprehensive estate planning documentation. The social pressure campaign continued for several weeks, but gradually faded as extended family members realized they were being manipulated into a conflict they didn't fully understand. Most of my relatives, once they learned the actual facts rather than Linda's carefully edited version, were appalled by my immediate family's tactics and quietly supportive of my right to manage my inheritance independently. The professional reputation concerns proved to be completely unfounded. Elizabeth and other colleagues who'd been approached by my family quickly realized they'd been given misleading information, and my standing in the business community actually improved as people learned about my responsible approach to managing significant wealth. But the personal cost was substantial. The relationships that had defined my entire life were permanently altered by their choices during this crisis. Linda never apologized for the lies she'd spread or the manipulation she'd orchestrated. Bob never acknowledged the unfairness of his demands or the cruelty of his psychological attacks. Tyler never recognized that his sense of entitlement to my resources had revealed something ugly about his character. They'd shown me who they really were when they thought $70 million was at stake, and I couldn't unsee that knowledge or pretend it didn't fundamentally change how I viewed our relationships. But I also discovered something wonderful about myself during this process. When faced with enormous pressure to compromise my values and judgment, I'd found the strength to stand firm. When threatened with isolation and rejection, I'd chosen integrity over approval. When offered the easy path of sharing wealth to maintain relationships, I'd chosen the harder path of authentic independence. Thomas's inheritance had given me more than financial security, it had given me the opportunity to discover who I really was when I finally had the power to be myself, without asking anyone's permission. I kept the ranch, working with James Rodriguez to expand its operations and create additional jobs in the community. I maintained the commercial properties, using the steady income to support local charities and scholarship programs. I grew the investment portfolio conservatively, focusing on sustainable returns rather than dramatic gains. But most importantly, I learned to use wealth as a tool for creating the kind of life I actually wanted rather than the kind of life other people expected me to fund for them. I traveled, pursued advanced education, invested in causes I cared about, and built relationships based on mutual respect rather than financial obligation. The first Christmas after the inheritance crisis was quiet, celebrated alone in my new home overlooking the Pacific Ocean. Weather purged, but it was also peaceful in a way that family gatherings had never been, free from the undercurrent of calculation and expectation that had colored every interaction with people who viewed my resources as opportunities for their own advancement. On New Year's Eve, I raised a glass of wine from grapes grown on my own land, toasting Thomas Chen, the uncle I'd never met who'd given me the greatest gift imaginable. The freedom to choose my own path, and the wisdom to recognize the difference between people who loved me and people who loved what I could provide for them. The inheritance had cost me a family, but it had given me something far more valuable, myself, authentic and independent, finally free to build a life based on my own values rather than other people's expectations. And that, I realized, was exactly what Thomas had intended all along. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.